Professor Dhar has joined?
Yeah, he will join, not a problem.
Okay.
So now we are online.
Yeah.
You're online? Okay, wonderful.
Yes, we are live. Yogesh, let us start.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Very good evening, good afternoon. Good evening to all audience in India, and good afternoon to other audiences in different parts of the world, especially in Europe, who are tuning in today for the NFSI panel discussion on TRIPS waiver proposal, state of play and the way forward. So we are pleased to organize this event as joint event between Chinmaya Viswavidyapeeth, National Law University Delhi, and the Inter-University Center for IPR Studies, Cochin University of Science and Technology, and the Third World Network, TWN. So as we know, access to medicines and medical technology has been a recurring concern across the globe, particularly in times of a pandemic. While intellectual property protection provides incentives to enable new research, it is also a major concern for inaccessibility of such technologies due to existence of global IP regime enforced primarily through the TRIPS agreement and various other international agreements. In response to the current pandemic COVID-19 crisis, India, along with South Africa, Kenya, Estwani approached the TRIPS Council to waive obligations regarding the protection and enforcement of certain IP rights to enable fight against the pandemic. While many developed countries have expressed their skepticism on the proposal, it obtained wide support from WTO member countries, international organizations like the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, academia, and social movements. Now, further deliberations on the proposal is going to take place in the TRIPS Council and the General Council at the WTO, which are currently underway. Against this background, under the aegis of the 4th International Conference on the New Frontiers in Sanskrit and Indic Knowledge, Chinmaya Viswavidyapeeth, along with all the co-organizers, is organizing this panel to understand the imperatives of the waiver proposal. The New Frontiers in Sanskrit and Indic Knowledge is a flagship annual international conference organized by Chinmaya Viswavidyapeeth. This is its 4th year edition. The conference is themed on law, public policy, and governance, exploring and evaluating Indian public policy and contemporary jurisprudence from the historical and indigenous perspective. The conference is supported by the Indian Council of Historical Research, New Delhi, as part of NFSI Working Group 3 on arenas of new knowledge production and Indian public policy, and Working Group 4 on India as a Vishwa Guru, Indian knowledge system, and preparing for the global future. The current panel is being organized due to the cross-cutting nature of issues around innovation and access and India's strategic concerns. Today, we have a fantastic panel with Professor Biswajit Dhar from the Center for Planning, Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Sciences, JNU, Jawaharlal National University. He is also the former member of the Board of Trade. Professor Dhar is a known name, and he has previously worked as the Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, at New Delhi. He has also been the professor and head of the Center for WTO Studies at IIFT, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. He has been a senior fellow at RIS, and before that, he has been consultant. He has collaborated on a lot of international consultancies and collaborations with the United Nations and various organizations. He has many papers to his credit. Anybody who works in the area of intellectual property and economics of IP, I think would know Professor Dhar's work. We also have with us Mr. Mohammed Mustaqeem De Gama, Ministry. He is currently the counselor of the South African mission at the WTO Geneva. Mr. Mustaqeem De Gama is an extraordinary professor also at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. He holds LLM from Belgium and LLD from the University of Pretoria. He is responsible for, previously has worked with the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa and heads International Trade and Investment Directorate. He's responsible for international investment policy and is currently the chief legal counsel for the all investment disputes. Mohammed also represents Government of South Africa at the OECD Investment Committee, UNCITRAL Working Group 2, SADC Investment Committee, and various other multilateral fora. We are glad to have Mr. Mohammed Mustaqeem De Gama joining in from Geneva today. We also have Dr. Hu Quing Vinong. She is LLB from Shillong University and LLM from Shillong University, and currently she's also a postdoctoral research associate at SOAS. So currently, Dr. Hugh Quinn Kong is a policy coordinator and the senior legal and policy advisor at the Maison Sans Frontières Access Campaign, that is Doctors Without Borders Access Campaign. She is a lawyer and postdoctoral research associate at the School of Law SOAS. She has many papers to her credit. Her PhD thesis was on medical patents in the right to health from monopoly control to open access. She has worked on reconceptualizing biomedical innovation and has a lot of papers to her credit. Anybody who's interested in more on health and access issues should look for Dr. Quinn's papers. And it's interesting that all three speakers today have an academic background along with the work that they are currently into. Apart from the speakers, we have with us Mr. K.M. Gopkumar, and we couldn't have had a better coordinator and moderator to arrange this panel and organize this panel. Thank you, Mr. Gopkumar. Mr. Gopkumar is a known name to all of us who have been part of the IP and access movements in the country and around the globe. And Mr. Gopkumar is also has academic background. He has taught at various other law schools, including at National Law University, Delhi. He has a background in law. He has a lot of publications in the area of IP and health. Currently, Dr. Gopkumar is a senior legal advisor at the Third World Network and a fellow at the Third World Network. Welcome, Dr. Gopkumar. Without much ado, I would like to ask Mr. K.M. Gopkumar to take it over from here. Thank you.
So you're mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you for this wonderful introduction to all the panelists and including me. And there is only small clarification. The doctorate is it's an honorary degree given by Yogesh. To obtain a PhD until now. So having said this, the world is there is a hope, and at the same time there is also despair. So there are news coming every day regarding new vaccines are getting approved or about to get approved, or the results of these, some of these vaccine trials are there. But at the same time, we are also reading the news that the people have to wait, especially people living in the developing countries have to wait to obtain access to these newly developed vaccines. So against this background, so we are looking at this access to medical products issue in the light of the waiver proposal proposed by South Africa, India, Kenya, and other countries, which enjoys now around co-sponsorship of around 8 to 9 countries. Let me, without much ado, invite Mr. Mustaqeem De Gama to make his intervention. So before inviting Mustaqeem, there are 3 housekeeping announcements. We will encourage people to use the question and answer or the chat box to raise questions, and we will have a presentation around each speaker. Will spend around 15 minutes, and then at the end of the session, we will have discussion. But before that, Mr. Mustaqeem has to go back to the WHO General Council meeting. Immediately after his presentation, we will open it for around 3 to 4 questions. Then we'll continue with the other panelists. So, Mr. Mustaqeem, please.
Gopa, thank you very much for the elaborate introduction. Let me thank the co-organizers of this very important event. I think it's always good to reach out to audiences across the world and to demystify really what is happening in the World Trade Organization. Gopa, I will probably not take up the full 15 minutes. I'm interested to have an interactive debate, which means I will try to keep it short, give some sort of update and context of our waiver proposal. But in the end, I'm more interested to answer the questions that the audience may have and perhaps also benefit from the insights that I may acquire from their interventions. And so from this point of view, many people have a question about our proposal and what it intends to do. But I have another question, and that is really, why do we need a proposal of this nature at this time if we have a multilateral system that is set up to regulate intellectual property? And so the question is, has this worked? Has this worked to be inclusive? Has this worked to inculcate the values of collaboration, of mutual benefit and development? And this is a broader question against which we have to see the COVID-19 waiver proposal. It is a matter of justice. It is also a matter of recalibrating our understanding of the barriers that we all face, especially as developing countries, to access the means that are necessary for us to develop. We are not poor because we don't have the means. We see that many members of the developing world have exceedingly rich cultures, long histories, yet at the current point in time, most of us are lagging behind. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is this happening? And so if we see it from this context, our waiver proposal really makes the case that there are certain barriers to our development. And one of the biggest barriers that we have observed since the establishment of the World Trade Organization is the TRIPS agreement and the concomitant intellectual property barriers that would have been erected. Gopa, I want to say that from a South African perspective, we have a long and sad history when it comes to HIV and AIDS. And so what we see in the current phase of the COVID-19 pandemic is exactly the same dynamic that we would have observed a good 20, 25 years ago. 25 years have elapsed and we haven't learned our lesson. We haven't fixed what needs to be fixed. And so this waiver proposal is not only about what's happening at the moment. It is not only about saving lives, but it also questions whether the system is set up in such a way that it addresses very legitimate concerns. Is it set up to protect only the interest of a few and negatively impact the interest of the many? Or should it be recalibrated that we reallocate the benefits of the system as such? And so there are many questions around the impact of globalization, and certainly part of this discussion today is really also how we can deal more effectively with the inequities that we've seen deepening over the last 20 to 25 years. And so, Chair, from that perspective, I just quickly wanted to go into one or two elements of the proposal. Firstly, is it justified? Certainly it is justified. COVID-19 is an exceptional circumstance, and under Article 9.3 of the Marrakesh Agreement, any country or groups of countries that want to bring a proposal to pass a waiver have to prove that there are exceptional circumstances. As co-proponents, we have done that with a lot of clarity and with a lot of support. We've established the scope of the waiver, which asks for the suspension and non-enforcement of certain parts of the TRIPS agreement. And these include IP rights such as copyright, industrial designs, patents, and then also undisclosed information. And we are calling for suspension of these rights for a period that will allow for COVID-19 to be defeated. That is, for a period when this disease can be eradicated. And so giving the policy space to countries to really take the destiny into their own hands and to effectively ensure that their citizens have access to medical products. Now, as Gopa rightly pointed out, in the last few weeks, we would have seen vaccines being fast-tracked and authorized. Yet there are many questions about issues of access. when will we be able to access these vaccines? We've seen institutional mechanisms such as CTAP, COVAX, Act A accelerator being agreed at a global level, but many of these are based on charity-driven mechanisms. And why do I say charity-driven? Because they make a promise that we will provide whatever is necessary for you to address the concerns that you raised, but necessarily this is not correct. If we look at the fine print, we see that less than 20%, in actual fact, much less than that, of the global population will be covered by any global promises that are made. And we have seen in the recent past, in the N1H1 crisis we had not too long ago, many developed countries making promises saying we will provide these vaccines to you. And when the time came to act, they bought up all the supplies and did not ensure that there would be equitable access. And so we have to learn our lessons from what has happened in the past. And so this particular waiver proposal tries to strike that particular balance. We've also heard that our waiver proposal puts at risk intellectual property, it puts at risk innovation. We vehemently deny that. And why do we say this? Because we see that a lot of the innovation that are responsible for some of the products which have been delivered in COVID, in this period of COVID-19, have nothing to do with IP. It relates to ordinary people collaborating, researchers, doctors, professors at universities being paid by governments, developing these particular vaccines and technologies, yet private companies are allowed to march in, take credit for the development, and then put prices on these products that are outside of the reach and the means of many of our populations and governments. This cannot be the model that is applied in a situation of crisis, in a situation of pandemic. It cannot be that profit trumps lives, and this waiver ensures that this outcome is not a reality that we have to live with. And so from a process perspective, as already indicated, the General Council is ongoing with a discussion of our waiver proposal and the way forward. I want to update the meeting that the chair of the TRIPS Council had indicated that we will continue our discussion in the TRIPS Council in the new year. But we as co-proponents have requested that this item be brought back to the General Council as soon as possible, and for an extraordinary General Council to be convened so that we can conclude on this matter, given the urgency of the surrounding situation. And so from that point of view, the process is really set, and we are really grateful for the support that we've received from many quarters, and remain optimistic that we will be able to forge some sort of a consensus. The narrative is already changing, and we hope by forcefully putting forward our points that we are able to reach at least some middle ground with some issues to be addressed now, but there are many questions about the future. How do we recraft the rules, not only of intellectual property, but of every other aspect of your multilateral institutional bias that work against developing countries? And so from that perspective, there is much work to be done, but we are privileged and honored to advocate the values of inclusivity, global cooperation, and global efficacy and safety for everyone that needs access to safe, efficacious medical products and processes to ensure that no one is left behind. And I close in saying, no one is safe until everyone is safe.
Thank you, Mustaqeem. That's a very clear and straightforward explanation behind the rationale of the waiver proposal. So we are aware that you have to go back to the General Council meeting. So let me open the floor for a few questions. So the floor is open. So Srinath, could you have a look at who would like to ask the questions? So those who would like to ask the questions at this moment, please raise their hands.
Yes, there is one question that has come through the chat. So the question is by Shefali Agarwal. So she asked, in such a situation of pandemic, is waiver of IPR better or allowing compulsory license? I think she wants to point to the opportunity of compulsory license and then the relevance of, in that context, the relevance of the waiver.
Second, you can go ahead with that.
You are on mute. Yes.
Okay. Let me quickly delve in here. Many countries that oppose the proposal has said exactly this. You have compulsory licenses which are available to you. But I want to say many of you who work in the field and on the ground will understand that the use of these compulsory licenses is very, very difficult, both from a legal perspective, but also from a political pressure perspective. Many of our co-proponents and members that support us complain that if they attempt to implement compulsory licenses, there are both legal and political consequences. So as a result, not many countries attempt to use compulsory licenses because of the perceived consequences of using these particular mechanisms under Article 31 or 31 bis. The other issue is really also whether or not it is possible. The other issue is also whether it is really possible to use compulsory licenses effectively. If every country has to issue a compulsory license product by product, area by area, region by region, this will take 10 years. We don't have 10 years. And so what the waiver does is it creates an automatic procedural and legal mechanism to enable countries to act together or individually to ensure that that the requirements that are set out in the TRIPS agreement do not act as a barrier. So as a good friend of mine once said, it does the paperwork so that we can actually do the work.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. N.M. Sundar. N.M. Sundarji, would you like to ask your question? You are on mute.
Yes, hello. Hello, I want to ask how the experience of the HIV crisis, going back now probably 30 years, when retrovirals were first patented, I think there was a similar outrage because they were selling at, I don't know, $30 a dose or something like that. And I think what ended up being the solution was Indian pharmaceutical companies that at that time were not bound by the regime went ahead and started producing it cheap. I think that was how it was addressed, but maybe the participants on the panelists have a more nuanced and more detailed view, and what are the lessons from that?
Perhaps I should just go ahead and try to respond and rely on the rest of the panel. I think that's right. If you look at the history of the TRIPS agreement before the entry into force of the TRIPS agreement and the formation of the World Trade Organization, there were various flexibilities in terms of possible supply and production. And so the lesson really was that once we started to address the IP issues and introduced competition from generic producers, what tended to happen was that we brought the prices down. And so we are only talking about one disease or groups of diseases. If you look at the health profile today, NCDs are through the sky. And so what we really see is that there is a greater need for further clarification in terms of how we can use the existing mechanism. So if I understand your question, really the historical lesson is the more producers you have and where IP does not necessarily constitute a barrier, the more collaboration you will have. And in the end, this brings down prices, it takes up quality, and it ensures that there is a sufficient value proposition for anyone entering that particular market. At the moment, you have very high thresholds, and those thresholds are also reinforced by the legal requirements, so-called safety and efficacy, quality controls, which are spurious necessarily. Look at India, look at China, look at the amount of API being supplied to European jurisdictions and the USA. So these are not necessarily concerns. The biggest issue today is not about capacity. It is about the ability to compete on price, competence, and I think many developing countries have the capacity to be big players if there would be a level playing field.
Any other questions?
Yes, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So another question is by Mr. Shashank Pandey. So he has asked one of the concern to the argument against that is raised against the proposal is that both India and South Africa possess sufficient capacity to exploit flexibility. Then why are the countries mooting for the waiver?
You can give the second question as well.
Yes. So the next question is. So is the waiver proposal also required to be adopted once it is passed by the member countries? That is by Professor Vanisri Ramanathan. There is another question also. Should I ask that?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So the next question is by Ashwati Prakash. So she asks us, even if the waiver proposal is passed, wouldn't its effectiveness largely depend on to what extent the individual state or parties are ready to cooperate on clinical trial data and so on. So does the proposal talk anything about how this is to come about? And then there are a couple more. Shall I go ahead? Yeah. So the next question is by...
I think let Mustaqeem answer the three questions.
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. So just on the first question, in relation to sufficient production capacity in India and South Africa, I think that question misses the point, because it's not only about India and South Africa. I think we have a global order that has resulted in many countries not having access and not having production capacity. We sit with a situation that many LDCs are not obligated to enforce the TRIPS provisions, but yet themselves have no capacity to produce and have to import. And so really the point here is that, yes, it requires, as I segue into the second question, it requires a global cooperation. We have to at least recognize that things are not going to happen automatically. I always say to our members, implement the TRIPS flexibilities, that these are the critical building blocks for your capacity. If you do not implement the flexibilities, if you do not create national practices that will allow you to customize to your own requirements, then of course you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. But if you tell countries to do this under a situation of pandemic, it stresses them even more. Most of them don't even have functioning IP systems. They don't have examination systems. Substantive examination doesn't happen, which means that many IP companies just patent dump. They create patent tickets, they evergreen. So if you get your capacity up one day, you'll be facing all of these patents which have been brought in while you did not have the capacity to do so. So I think in the end, we have to look at the broader picture. Certainly COVID-19 has kind of focused on this particular issue. On passing and implement adoption of the waiver. So should the waiver be passed by the General Council? Well, there's various ways in which countries can do it. Given the fact that we are in a situation of international pandemic, many of us have emergency legislation, which means that we can, in a very fast-track way, incorporate this and suspend the IP rights which we deem to be necessary. So not all of us are in the same position. Not all of us will be able to suspend or not enforce the same type of rights. It depends if you're an importer, if you're an exporter, if you have limited capacity, and also depending on how many patents are relevant in your jurisdiction. So it will depend on the country, and it would also be needs-based. It could also work on a regional basis, as Article 31(3) makes a provision for regional collaboration. So that would also be possible, but if you just read out the substantially requirement that 50% of members should be part of this regional arrangement.
Yes. There is another
burning questions.
Yes. This question is from Ruchika Yadav. She asked, with many countries who have signed TRIPS plus FTAs, will this proposal have an overriding effect on such TRIPS plus agreement as well?
I'll take two more before I have to go. Is that the last one?
There are many more questions, but yes, I'll pick it. Yes. This question is from Mr. Nitin Ramakrishnan. He asked, why is that we see less reference of legal principles of international economic cooperation in the text of TRIPS waiver proposal? Say, for example, reference to international covenants on socio-economic and cultural rights.
Yes, and the third question, quickly.
The next question is from Aman Sinha. He asked, does the panel feel that the vaccines should not be encouraged, and given that there are trials for drugs for such ivermectin, which is very affordable and safe drug ongoing, and the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines are at question. So should it have the same effect?
Okay, so very quickly on the TRIPS Plus, I think if you look at all of the FTAs, many of them having IP chapters, you will see that all of them are in line with the basic precepts of the TRIPS agreement, given the fact that the TRIPS agreement sets minimum standards. Even though these go beyond in many respects, it does recognize TRIPS flexibilities, it does recognize the importance of the Doha Declaration. And so from that point of view, there is a baseline, I think, that that will safeguard even countries that are involved in these FTAs. So from that perspective, if you read it back into the TRIPS agreement, many of them will have these exceptions, will have a recognition of the importance of public health measures that are taken under certain circumstances. Where these agreements go further, they may limit the circumstances in which members may act, but nonetheless, that is another discussion that we can have regarding how these are to be interpreted. And it's not only under FTAs, I think it's also potentially under investment agreements or investment chapters that are contained in so-called FTAs. The lesser reference to international economic law principles and so forth, I think the whole waiver proposal is built on a recognition of the underlying international economic legal order. And this waiver proposal really questions whether intellectual property clearly reflects the principles and consensus that have been built over the last 50 or 60 years. And so from that perspective, when I do read the proposal, I read it in a narrow sense, reference to IP, but we also see that IP is a larger phenomenon in respect of human rights, in respect of trade and development, and certainly would be one of the factors that we have to take into account in really looking at achieving the SDG 2030 targets and objectives. So I think the waiver really goes a very long way in clarifying and actually elucidating the underlying international economic law principles that we feel has been distorted over the last while in the name of liberalism, in the name of trade liberalization, to the extent that we now see very watered down international standards applying across the board in many areas. On the third question about the efficacy and safety of vaccines, I think this is something that we all have questions. At the moment, the details are quite thin. even even regulatory authorities are not willing to discuss the basis on which they have given these fast-track authorizations. The European Union, I think, has a very difficult situation, and we believe that the Swiss authorities have a file where they have requested more information on at least one vaccine candidate being proposed for fast-track authorization in Switzerland. And so from this perspective, the data is not yet apparent. I think this is part of the transparency debate that we are also putting on the table through the waiver proposal. We feel that there is still a better understanding which would have to be gained from the data. And so from that perspective, we continue at least to ask questions about the quality of the data, the efficacy of the vaccines. And a major question is, but what are the long-term effects? Does the vaccine create a similar immune reaction to your body that naturally occurs once you become infected? So does that immunity last for 3 months, 6 months, 8 months? Is it long-term, short-term? Would it be that you require re-administration of this vaccine every year? And so these are all questions that have not perfectly been answered because it's just still too soon. And so we may have to wait until perhaps the end of next year to really get substantial data to have proper authorizations, marketing authorizations at least, be issued in this regard.
So, you've got time. Can I?
Okay, let's take 2 more and then I have to go.
So one is something that we all are anxiously waiting to know what about. So Professor Ritesh asked, how optimistic are you about passing the proposal? And the second question is from Sunita Tripathi. So she asks if you could explain whether there is any discussion going on know-how transfer in the event that we have a waiver proposal being passed successfully, wholly or partially, and to what extent.
Thanks. These are 2 very, very important questions. Am I optimistic? I am exceedingly optimistic. Why? Because when we put this proposal in October, everyone told us that we were crazy. No one wanted to discuss this. The major economies dismissed this as foolishness, as irresponsible conduct. And I can tell you in the General Counsel, which I will return to in a few minutes, we are hearing many, many different messages from what this has started. And so from that perspective, we feel that the needle has definitely moved. There is a space that is opening up for further discussion. And so we will take advantage of this because everyone recognizes the imperfection of the current system. And so I think I have a lot of hope that we can reach some sort of consensus. My only concern is that we do it soon enough to ensure that everyone can access the appropriate technology as it becomes available, or where it is available, that it is made available in a way that is equitable, reasonable, and accessible. And so that's my biggest worry. My biggest worry at this point is the speed at which things move. We cannot afford to have this discussion until next year or the following year. This just doesn't work. So in my anticipation, I am very, very, very optimistic that our continued discussion could meet with success. I just wanted to say in the last 3 months, we've made more progress on many of the fundamental IP issues than in the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, India, South Africa, some of the BRICS countries and some BRICS Plus countries have put 11 proposals in the TRIPS Council, many of them unanswered, many of them where developed countries have said that this should not be discussed in the TRIPS Council. And now they are actually acknowledging that it is a legitimate right to use TRIPS flexibilities to issue compulsory licenses. So I think that scope for discussion has definitely moved. This is for the current phase. Now, the second question is even more important. How do we ensure that we have, transfer of know-how, technology, and so forth? How do we access it? One of the reasons why we formulated the waiver proposal a bit more wider to include undisclosed information, to include a copyright As a subset of copyright, we have other issues such as algorithms, source codes, for example, know-how, trade secrets. And so from that perspective, the rules are not very clear. We have some examples in the EU, in the US, but this is not something that is commonly discussed. So we want to discuss how flexibilities apply beyond traditional patents, where we feel that this discussion has been limited. South Africa did put a proposal into the October TRIPS Council where we posed the question, what are the flexibilities beyond patents? Because this is not clear, and I think we should use future discussions to clarify these, especially also in the digital space.
Thank you so much. I think there are many more questions that we want to ask, but we do understand how busy your schedule is today. Professor Gopan, sir, it's up to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustaqeem, for very eloquently explaining us the proposal, its rationale, and also taking time on a GC meeting day to answer our questions too. Thank you so much, and we wish you all the best in your efforts and your colleagues there to push this, and we would like to see an extraordinary General Council meeting to discuss this issue in the first quarter itself. Thank you so much, and yeah, wish you a very happy New Year and in the coming and a productive New Year in the couple of weeks ahead.
Thank you, Gopa. It was an honor and a pleasure to address this meeting, and let me also extend year-end wishes and certainly a hope and an aspiration that next year will bring much better for all of us. We need to address this virus at the same time for everyone. The world economy has to open up, and the longer we wait for access, the longer we have to lock down, and this has severe economic impacts. 600 million people are projected by the World Bank to be back into poverty and extreme poverty. We need to address this. I think it's important that we take this forward in this way. But thanks very much, and greetings to each and every person signed on to this meeting. All the best, be safe, and we have hope for some solutions, at least early in next year.
Thank you, Mr. King.
Bye-bye.
So let me now invite our friend Yuan. Yuan is bringing around the 20 years of MSF's struggle on access to medicine. It's also a 20 years either MSF has themselves faced while accessing many of the affordable generic medicine to provide in various countries, or the story of the various developing countries who face difficulties in ensuring access to affordable medicine. At the same time, I'm sure Yuan will be looking at and explaining it with more from the story from the field. Why do we need a waiver? Yuan, and the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes, and I will sort of can alert you when you reach around 13 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gopa, and thank you, everyone. I think Mustaqeem has addressed some of the most important issue around the waiver proposal. So I will just share some of the observation from MSF side. I'll just share my screen here. So in terms of the experiences and observation from our work in the past 20 years, I want to just quickly go through a few arguments around the proposal itself and why the opponents and the suspicious parties think the merit of the proposal needs to be questioned, and what we think the reality is actually telling us. So here is a very quick overview of what kind of myths and realities we are trying to outline in a briefing document I put link here online. So the first one, as we said, is industry and other parties said IP is not issue in a pandemic, and then it's about distribution, it's about manufacture facility and capacities, but we think this kind of understanding is quite challenging. It's questionable. Past experience has shown us the traditional way of addressing IP barrier is once you identify the barrier, and then you take measures potentially to oppose the patent or issue compulsory license and do something else to invoke the validity of the patent. So some of the freedom to operation could be issued. However, in this pandemic, we think a more preventive approach are needed. So in reality, we already see a number of indications when patent and other intellectual property would provide a concern and potential barrier. So on therapeutics, we already see a number of repurposed therapeutics in the pipeline, and we know in some countries, some of the second medical use and indication could potentially be resorted to patent protection. So in India, it will probably have more stringent patentability criteria, and that can be used to curb, to tackle some of the evergreening strategy. However, it doesn't mean, once India can do something, other country will be safe, because we are looking into cleaning up the legal uncertainty around the potential therapeutics. And we also see companies continue using voluntary license in a very limited manner to address a global pandemic, and excluded many countries who have manufacturing capacity, and excluded countries who have high burden of infection from benefiting from the generic supply. Of course, this example of remdesivir is now out of date because the drug has been delisted, but the IP practice of Gilead really set up a very negative example. And we also see the biologic pipeline and some of the antiviral repurposed medicine showed a very high level of patenting globally. So if some of them becomes effective once the clinical data demonstrates, in order to quickly come up with a generic supply, the IP issue need to be addressed. For vaccine as well, whereas I think Mustaqeem explained the issue of vaccine manufacture, but it's in our observation, it is also problematic to see IP isn't an issue. It is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed when we look at large portfolio of background patents on some of the key vaccine technologies that has been used for COVID development. Many of the technology were developed before the pandemic, and then now are used for COVID vaccine. So this, the new patent and IP applied for this year may not be fully manifested yet because of the duration interval between application and publication. And so we discussed the know-how and data, so I wouldn't repeat. From MSF experiences also in the past, we have seen concrete example how the excessive kind of patent strategy hindered and stopped development process of follow-on producers on pneumococcal conjugate certain vaccine. So the industry sector, vaccine manufacturer sector, is very pro to a large portfolio of patenting as well. So we also observed the full development line of vaccine from the starting material until the finished product, including method of use, the schedule of vaccine, for instance, 2-dose regimen or 1-dose regimen, and then the age group and presentation and so on and so forth, have been subject to patent application in many jurisdictions. And this kind of practice invites huge uncertainty and could slow down and potentially block the use of vaccine, even if someone can come up with alternative products. So other arguments suggest that IP-enabled R&D, therefore, the waiver would weaken the system and it discouraged R&D. So I think we discussed earlier from MSF perspective, we also don't think so, because in the COVID pandemic, it is public funding actually accelerated the R&D output. And so the monopoly-based model is not really fitting the purpose. So the argument industry normally make to see they have taken a huge risk and then take everything on their own and that need to be rewarded and need to recoup are not really standing in this pandemic, because we have a huge unprecedented public support and the government around the world are even taking away the risk from a company in terms of production and delivery. So it is really, for us, it's endless requests. So no matter how many public support the industry are getting, it won't be enough for them. So this is kind of a myth, we think, not really standing. Other argument against waiver argue that the best way to address IP and technology issue is to rely on voluntary measures. But we have recently published a report on voluntary license, summarizing nearly 15 years observation and experience with a voluntary license. And our conclusion, I mean, many of colleagues here probably very familiar with voluntary license, is that there are so many instances when terms and conditions can be so restricted and limiting the competition and hindering supply options. So there's many restricted terms often used to limit the supply. So geographic scope, basically where generic company can supply, and where and how you can produce and buy raw material. And then anti-diversion requirement can be very excessive, asking doctors like my organization to be the IP enforcer, which is totally unacceptable. And there could also be terms and conditions allowing company to produce but not supply their home country, which is very common in contract manufacturer model. But this also happens in IP license as a kind of a restricted term. So those terms should not be used in the pandemic. However, we face a very huge dilemma in the pandemic in terms of voluntary license. When company claim, I'm signing license with India company, Chinese company, and South Africa company, and Brazilian company, we have a very limited visibility of what they are actually signing. The only IP license that has been partially disclosed, it was from Brazil, and all of the term and condition related to IP right are redacted, not published. So we don't really know what the company are signing to, and to what extent that will have a mid and long-term implication when it's come to supply option at the global level. So other means include TRIPS flexibility, such as composite license, are sufficient. I think Mustaqeem has explained the limitations, so which is also our observation. We know, for instance, India alone has been under systemic and long-term political pressure in terms of using composite license. After the first composite license, and so far the only one issued in India, US TR has consistently pressuring India not to use that again. So those kind of pressure also happen in other developing countries. So we're not really facing a purely legal issue, but it's intertwined with the political context developing countries are facing. So even if we are talking about the composite license, the case by case and product by product and country by country approach is really not really enough. Even with the Article 30B special composite license, it's remain cumbersome when it's come to the procedural requirements. When one country, so that system would have one country help another, but only to the requesting country have to specify quantity needed each time, and then the other country would have to, the producer have to differentiate packaging and taking other measures to prevent anti-diversion, to prevent diversion. So all of these requirements that would restrict supply and restrict the global reach would not really lead us to the maximum benefit of getting access to medicine. So we acknowledge trips availability are super important. So when countries have opportunity to use it in a pandemic, they have to use it in the full. But the waiver proposal really provided one additional policy option for country to choose. So other claim, I think Mustaqeem has explained the COVAX and other measures. I will skip here. And the last one is really constantly coming up in some of the opinion pieces by the industry and saying that even if you remove IP barrier, developing countries have no capacity to produce. So they don't, I mean, some opinion pieces even said, you know, in many developing countries, even you give them vaccine, they don't know how to distribute. So no need to mention let them to produce. They're totally incompetent. So we think that those comments are really inappropriate and wrong. As many instances in the history has proven, developing country often mastering the advanced technologies on medicines and vaccines. India remains the pharmacy for developing countries because of its robust development and research development and the production supply capacity. So and many, you know, European and market and UK, US, India supply have a substantive share. So it's very wrong to see a developing country has no capacity to produce. And we also see in the past, developing country independent developers who has no access to technology transfer has developed their own version of vaccine with the perceived very complex technology nobody can do, but they did it independently. And in this pandemic, India now is one of the front runner to develop thermostable mRNA vaccine. So it's quite difficult to comprehend those kind of view that developing countries are just incapable. They don't need to do anything, just wait there. So we think all of these arguments are a mixture of factors that present us with a technical, political, and structural barrier that the waiver process, waiver proposal debate really provide us a unique opportunity to look into. So I will stop here, and then the link here is with some publication from MSF for your reference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuan. It's a very prompt presentation, and taking less than 2 minutes, you concluded your presentation. So we will be sharing your presentation with the participants, in the coming days. And now let me invite Professor Vishwa. He's already introduced. He's a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, but I would like to give a piece of information. How do we look at, he's one of the persons who was part of the National Working Group on Patent Laws, which was established around 1987 to warn the India's policymakers about the effects of TRIPS agreement. So now around 35 years plus, how do you look at the situations, and how, your group's own analysis about these things? Unfortunately, I think it's all came true, and I invite Professor Dar to share his views, especially focusing on the waiver and its prospects.
Yeah, thank you, Gopa, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. And I think it was very important for us to understand a lot of the nuances and the details regarding the waiver proposal, because there is a lack of clarity. The more I speak to people, I find that there is a lack of clarity as to why India and South Africa should take this initiative at this point. There have been various perspectives given, including one that Mr. Mustaqeem had mentioned, that there is already a declaration on TRIPS agreement and public health, which was arrived at the Doha Ministerial Conference in 2001. So the questions that have been asked is, if we have this declaration on TRIPS agreement and public health, there's been some instruments which have been given. Why do we need another proposal, another waiver that South Africa and India are asking for? I think it's really important to really go back and look at what happened in that the Doha Declaration and what has been achieved since then. The first thing is that, of course, the Doha Declaration was very candid about the relationship between TRIPS and public health. And I'll just read out one paragraph, which actually said that this is the ministers articulating their views, that we agree that the TRIPS agreement does not and should not prevent members from taking measures to protect public health. Accordingly, while reiterating our commitment to the TRIPS agreement, we affirm that the TRIPS agreement can and should be interpreted and implemented in a manner supportive of WTO members' right to protect public health, and in particular, to promote access to medicines for all. Now, where have we gone from after this was articulated and this was agreed by all the WTO members at that time? In fact, things have only gone downhill from there. Let me emphasize this. As far as the whole the intellectual property regime is concerned, there has been ratcheting up of IP laws through FTAs or through bilateral pressures, and countries have been forced to implement provisions that are not strictly in line with the minimum requirements under the TRIPS agreement. Also, I would say that there was this window of opportunity provided to the countries who do not have manufacturing facilities, the so-called Para 6 solution. But as we know, that is far from a solution. It's become more of a problem, so that only one country had applied, and that also was not really was very effective. So the net result is that despite making this pitch in the Doha Declaration, we have come to a situation where access to medicines has become even more difficult. The news around the developing countries have actually strengthened, and access to medicines have become more and more problematic. And all of you all of us actually recognize this, that over the past several years, if anything, prices of medicines have actually just gone up. So I think there was the waiver, in my view, also reminds the global community that there is this imperative of implementing TRIPS agreement in a manner that also meets the demands of access to medicines at affordable prices. And since this has not happened, in a pandemic situation, we are finding that there are a whole lot of uncertainties about how countries are going to get access to the vaccines and medicines, and again at prices that they can afford. I think this is what the waiver proposal actually does. It's a strong reminder to the global community that things need to be done and done urgently. Again, I'll go over some of the points that my fellow panelists have actually raised, or rather have answered. Of course, there is this this question about why not compulsory license. and Dr. Hu very rightly rightly stated this, that look, in a country like India, which is had compulsory licenses really embedded in its patent law. All that we have done in these 15 years since we have had a product patent regime is a singular compulsory license. And despite
muted, Professor.
Sorry,
there is the sound is dropped.
Oh, sorry. I think is it all right now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, I think it was my phone which is raining somewhere. We know, Gopa and I and several friends have been from MSF. We have been trying to see how this whole the use of compulsory license can be expanded here, but somehow it hasn't happened. There are lots of conjectures and views expressed. I'm not going to reiterate any of them here. But the point is that even in the best case scenario, like an Indian Patent Act, compulsory license could not be issued, and also compulsory license takes its own sort of time, and you cannot actually get things done off in a hurry. So it's very important for us to actually look at quick solutions in order to fix the problem that we are facing. Now, what are the major pain points, if I may, in this as we are looking at access to medicines and vaccines in the wake of the COVID pandemic? I think the first issue that really strikes us is the lack of transparency about the research that is going on, about the clinical trials, and this is happening because the companies and their host governments are helping them to protect the data and to enable them to keep the data secret. So that there are all kinds of views going around about the efficacy of the COVID vaccines. We don't know how long it is going to last. If they are injected, you take a full course of two shots. You don't know how long it is going to last. And the stories that have been coming out in the newspapers about the efficacy issue really raises serious questions. So protecting all this data under trade secrets, and which is what is happening, and there have been attempts to extend this kind of protection to other countries which do not provide statutory protection to test any other data, is something that is of really serious concern to all of us. Also, what we are seeing is that the companies have been telling us that they are not enforcing their rights. In several cases, like in case of vaccines, we have heard that many of the companies have indicated that they're going to be waiving their rights. They won't exercise their rights over IP in this period. But when you sort of start looking at cases and start looking at particular instances, you find that there is very much a kind of indirect exercise of rights. For instance, consider these voluntary licenses that have been granted by Gilead for the production of remdesivir in different countries, including India. Now, a voluntary license is really a problematic instrument, because it really puts the two parties, the licensee and the licensor, in a very cozy relationship. And at the end of the day, you find that the patient suffers. Now, in a compulsory license, of course, the government is in a position to fix the price of the medicine, like we saw in the case of, when the NATCO was given the compulsory license, and the price was fixed for the medicine. In case of voluntary license, there isn't any case, and study that Gopa and I did a few months back on remdesivir being sold in India. We found that the price at which some of the companies were selling the medicine in India on a purchasing power terms was higher than that was sold by Gilead in the United States. So, in terms, on the yardstick of transparency, yardstick of affordability, this was a failure. So really, voluntary licenses are hugely problematic. And the last thing that I would talk about is access to the vaccines and medicines. And we are already seeing a huge spate of what we are calling vaccine nationalism. Most of the developed countries are now trying to corner whatever vaccines are available, and countries like Canada and European Union have amassed, also US have amassed such huge stocks of these vaccines, which will be produced, which are in the pipeline, that it will actually meet their needs of the population several times over. So you have a situation today where the countries, in the developing world, are really staring at a situation where access to these vaccines may not come anytime even next year, even in India, I have my doubts whether a large percentage of the population is really going to get access to the vaccines even in 2021. And we know that unless everyone is vaccinated, we can't see the end of COVID. So I think it's very important for countries to get access to technology as soon as possible. These technologies should be in the public domain, so that countries can pick up the technology and start running with them and start producing them. And it's also very important for us to look at after that cooperative models where regional arrangements could come into play. For instance, we could have some arrangement in South Asia, Southern Africa, and so on and so forth in the developing world. And that can only happen if we have many more countries who are able to produce these these products, the vaccines and medicines, and they are able to supply it at an affordable price. Now, I thought, just recollecting the points that Dr. Hu made. She made a very important point about the fact that the developed countries have often turned around and told us that you do not have the production, the capabilities to produce these products. Now, I've been studying this issue of technology transfer for decades now, and this has been a kind of a red herring that has been there, that even if we transfer technology to the developing countries, they will not be able to do justice to the technology that we have developed, and therefore that doesn't make any sense to transfer it. Now, but during these decades, we have found many developing countries who have acquired the technology, the capability to produce these complex products, and they have actually motored along. They would have done much better if, for instance, they were not restricted in their ability to access technology by the intellectual property regime. If the intellectual property regime was much more open, and countries did, and the large pharma did not indulge in the kind of preventing others from accessing those technologies, the world could have been a much better place. but unfortunately, that's not it. So I think finally I would say that it is time that that the global community learns to live in a cooperative framework. It is it really doesn't help anyone, because in this age of rapid movement of people across international borders, it cannot be a case that the United States feels that it is safe, while many of the developing countries where their companies do business, these kinds of pandemics are raging. So I think they have to recognize that it is in their interest, it is in their commercial interest to ensure that the rest of the world is safe, and people are people get access to all the medicines and vaccines they need to keep themselves safe. I think it's very unfortunate that you have to tell these countries in pure commercial terms, because anything else, any kinds of enunciation of human rights and other things have fallen to deaf ears. So I'll stop at that, and thank you again to the co-organizers for giving me this opportunity to express my views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dhar. And now the floor is open for questions. Srinath, could you help us to read out some of the questions? Or also, if people would like to ask the questions, please raise their hands. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. So the first question comes from Mr. Naveen Gopal. Naveen, would you like to ask a question in person?
I think if questions are typed here, you can ask.
Right.
You okay. Please read out, and please specify to whom it is directed. If there is a people mentioned that it is either to Professor Dhar or to Yuan. Otherwise,
yes. All right.
So read.
So this is.
You can go ahead.
Sure. So this is to the panel, I presume. So the question goes: why isn't the public interest exception under Article 39.3 of TRIPS not being explored, which says members shall protect such data against disclosure except where necessary to protect the public? So that is the first question. The second question: shall I take 2 to 3 questions and then?
Yeah, please. 3 questions each. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second question is from Shivapriya. So she asked that since the proposal or the support to the proposal being of national interest, what is the interest of the developed countries when it comes to waiving off? What are the interests that they could see in the proposal? That is the second question. And yes, the third question is that even is by Cecil. Cecil asked that even if TRIPS is waived, won't the domestic legislation still hinder will still hinder the execution of the waiver?
You can both of you can decide, and divide and answer the questions. Okay, you can choose the questions. Yuan, you would like to go ahead first?
For the domestic.
Yeah, maybe on the question on Article 39.3, for instance.
Yeah. I think for Article 39.3, the waiver proposal, as we know, is beyond the patent, so it includes a number of provisions, and Article 39 is included, which we think is actually very important one, because we know in some countries said they commit to provide exclusive protection on data because of 39.3, and we know that interpretation is very problematic because there's no exclusive rights as an obligation for a member. But some member in their accession document, they did say they commit to do that. But then for those countries, they can actually use a waiver to temporarily lift up what they said they are going to do in their accession document to WTO. But for other countries who don't have exclusive protection of clinical data, I think and when the regulatory body probably will face difficulty, because there's another issue. Even if you have no exclusive right to the originator company, it is Article 39 still requires some protection against an unfair kind of unfair competition of using the data depend on national law scenario. I think if the policy objective is to make sure the company cannot claim the total control, and then the regulator should be able to use those data and accelerate generic kind of registration process, and at some point, I think earlier in the pandemic, some researcher also suggests regulators, they should actually share data to each other and also make that a kind of a public information, because some of the manufacturing information are quite common across the board. So I think the waiver proposal itself could also help lifting some of the restrictions facing by the regulatory agencies.
Professor Dhar, would you like to?
Yeah, let me try and answer the other questions. The interest of developed countries in the waiver. I think I mentioned briefly in my presentation towards the end that I think the developed countries will have to recognize that this is a pandemic of unprecedented proportions, and unless everyone is safe, no one is safe, and that is first and the foremost for them to understand. But they don't seem to be understanding this. Like I said, about the vaccine nationalism that is on. So I think we need to sort of these kinds of dialogue that we are having today are vital for us to give them this message that, look, you don't think that you can just quarantine yourself in your own country and then pretend that you're going to be safe. You're not going to be safe. So you have to look at it in the larger perspective of sort of global public health, and only then can you ensure that the pandemic is behind us. On hindrance by domestic legislations, I don't think that'll be the case, because I think if the flexibilities are offered in terms of using the TRIPS agreement in a manner that is conducive to addressing this kind of pandemic, the national legislations will have no effect, because only when the national legislations today are in line with the TRIPS agreement, and therefore if we try to go and try and put a carve out there, which is seen to be or it's supposed is seen to be a violation of our TRIPS commitments, then we can attract then we can be taken to a dispute. But if the TRIPS agreement itself gives a waiver, then of course whatever we do in our national space will be a part of the flexibility that we have. So the national legislation is not really we will not be an hindrance at all.
I think I also just would like to add here, even in the current Indian situation, the legal instrument we use to respond to COVID-19 is one of the instruments is the Disaster Management Act. The Section 62 of the Disaster Management Act actually allows you to suspend any of the existing legislation. So if you have a waiver, you don't need even to go to a parliament to incorporate that in our patent law or in any of the IP law. You can suspend it using the Disaster Management Act. So what prevents us from currently doing is the lack of policy space at the international law, or international law prevents us from doing it. Srinath, please.
Thank you. Then we have a question from a friend in press from San Jose, Costa Rica. So he would like to know what is the situation right now, like what has happened yesterday at the WTO TRIPS meeting, and how did the vote turn out? And he would also like to know if there is more information on that. So so another question is from Sunita. Sunita is asking to Dr. Dhar that you have mentioned about Gilead's voluntary license strategy in India being uneven. So she was asking if you could kindly elaborate on the failure to benefit from differential pricing in India, especially since the same may result from imported COVID vaccine. There are a couple of questions to Professor Dhar again. Ranja Sen Gupta asks that would you think that the Ottawa Group's proposal, they are saying addressing IP is not needed, but export restriction, trade facilitation, etc. is the way to go. So he would like to know your opinion on that. And yes, Priya Anurakini also asked to Professor Dhar on the question of Doha Declaration and the consequent amendments. And TRIPS has not much use so far. So what changes must be made so as to make TRIPS amendment to fulfill the intent of the Doha Declaration? I think that question can go to the whole panel too. Thank you.
So shall I answer? I think Sunita's question. I think this is what I was mentioning, that the voluntary licenses are quite opaque, and of course it is on the face of it, we heard that or we read that the licenses allow the freedom to the companies, to the Indian companies, to set their own prices. So that's been publicly mentioned. But when it comes to the actual implementation of the licenses, we find that this differential is there. So quite obviously, of course, we know that it is in the interest of the originator company to have to see higher prices in India, because they can get higher returns from selling the products here. And of course, if the vaccine or the medicines are produced in India, then they won't, to make a case for imported medicines from any other country doesn't really make much sense, because the imported medicines, the prices could with all the transactions cost and all, it could actually be higher. But the point I was actually trying to make is that in the current situation, the exercise of IP rights is resulting in a perverse situation, in a difficult situation for the patients, and that is the exercise of through the exercise of the rights and the grant of voluntary licenses. Ranja's point about the Ottawa Group, of course, is going nowhere. Providing market access means what? They are actually demanding faster liberalization in this times of pandemic. Now, when many of their own countries are becoming, they're pursuing policies of economic nationalism, they're becoming more protectionist. These guys come and tell us that you need to open up your markets, and all in the interest of addressing this COVID pandemic. Now this is hypocrisy and nothing else. I think that will be my reaction. The Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health, of course, I mentioned quite it's very clear that it's been a failure. The freedom to grant compulsory license is really not there. We know for a fact that there are all kinds of political pressures which are imposed on countries so that they do not use compulsory license. Again, there is a hypocrisy out there, because if you look at the way many of the developed countries like Germany and others have responded to the pandemic, they have actually used compulsory licenses, that we should compulsory licenses. But when it comes to the developing countries, there have always been pressures, bilaterally or otherwise, for countries not to use it. The Doha solutions are they don't mean anything. I think they are not even worth the paper they were printed on. I think they need to be junked, and what needs to be done is that the poorer countries need to be given access to these affordable medicines in as transparent and as easier way as possible. Going through all these kind of bureaucratic processes only makes life difficult for these countries which do not have capacity to deal with these problems in any case. Thank you.
You would like to comment on the next processes in Geneva? What do you expect out of this GC decision? Or what would be the next?
Yes, I was trying to gather. I think for the maybe very quickly, we heard that the General Council meeting actually got prolonged today. As we know, Mustaqeem just returned to the meeting, and the TRIPS Council chair's statement was already out. I think there is an official document on WTO website, basically informing that due to the lacking of consensus among members, they will continue the discussion until in the new year. So we heard there might be informal sessions of the TRIPS Council in Q1 of 2021. But it's quite a difficult situation now, because I think I just saw the UK published their statement to the General Council online. EU probably will also publish. Many of those opposing countries are still holding the view that IP is the enabler to develop the COVID-19 medical tools. Which for us is not really correct. So I think it's going to be a continuation in the TRIPS Council in terms of these debates. But we do hope that there's also kind of self-lining. We see some country, and there's more support from developing countries. And we saw, for instance, Mongolia and Venezuela became the official co-sponsors in the past few days, and then Africa group as a whole have changed from a general supporter to fully support the proposal. But I think going forward, especially in Q1, more intensified negotiation will still happen among the different countries, and India and South Africa as a leading sponsors to this proposal will still continue their bilateral diplomatic outreach. So hopefully, and from our perspective as MSF, we really want the government to accelerate the consensus building, because this proposal really benefits everyone. And also as a rule of WTO, it's also important to note that a waiver mechanism has been used for so many times in the past. So this is completely normal to seek a waiver and the WTO rule. And the waiver itself also does not constitute a mandatory obligation for all WTO members. It is option. So a country who don't want to use waiver, they can just leave it without blocking the process. But as we think this process will be an intertwined process between legal arguments and the political dynamic among different countries.
So Srinath, any more set of very important or burning questions? Then you can read out them. Then otherwise we can.
There is one question from Arati Ashok. So she asked on the context of patent revocation possibility within domestic legislations. So can't we have it implemented and go in for a mass scale local protection? I think she points to the need of on the requirement of an international waiver rather than a domestic solution.
So I think it is in the Indian context. Maybe Professor Dar, could you?
Yeah, I think, patent revocation has always been a very contentious issue. Because, even in several instruments that we are trying to develop at the international level, especially context of protection of traditional knowledge and, sort of protecting the biodiversity. Any suggestion that lack of disclosure will attract penal provisions like revocation of patent has always been. We've always faced serious opposition from the developed countries in the World Intellectual Property Organization. The negotiations that are going on, so I think that if we start try to revoke any of these patents, there's going to be a serious repercussion there, because we'll be violating our obligations under TRIPS, and we can easily be dragged to the dispute, and there is no and the conclusion of the dispute will be very clear. Is very clear that we are going to lose those disputes. So I don't think that without having an enabling instrument in the TRIPS agreement, which allows us to overrule the patents that are there, or sort of bypass the rights that we have already granted by way of patents through our domestic legislation. Without that enabling provision in the TRIPS agreement, we just can't do anything. We cannot actually bypass the patent rights. We have to recognize the patent rights that have been granted in this country.
So there is just one more question which been repeated by two people. So I think that I'll take it.
Please go ahead.
Yes. So Professor Vanisri Ramanathan and Shivani Gupta, both of them asked that with waiver being being a short-term solution, what is the possibility of finding a balance between the interests of the rights of the IP holders and the need for access medicine for a long term? What would be the idea of the panel?
Yeah, I think the long term solution is really to find the right balance, and one of the options is to, of course, look at legislations like India has provided. We have several checks and balances. Now the caveat there is that our legislation should be allowed to function the way it has been designed to. So if you have political pressures, so no matter what you do in terms of designing the domestic legislation or getting enabling provisions from the TRIPS agreement, provide some flexibilities there. But if political pressures remain, no matter what you do, you will not be able to provide access to medicines at affordable prices, because all the time, even before the TRIPS agreement, since the time we had the draft agreement on with us, we have been emphasizing that the articles 7 and 8 of the TRIPS agreement, which talks about the balance of rights and obligations of the patent holders and the users of the technology that has been, or the knowledge that has been protected, or proprietary knowledge, that is absolutely essential. But the more we it seems that the more we have emphasized this thing of a balance, in reality, the imbalance has grown even larger. So I think what is absolutely imperative is for all those concerned with these issues, I think we need to raise the level of debate on these issues at a substantially higher level. I know that when the South African case came, the HIV/AIDS, and violation that was committed by the pharma companies. There was such a lot of discussion and debate on these issues that the TRIPS agreement, the Doha Declaration became an inevitable consequence of that push coming from the public domain. Now, unfortunately, we haven't seen this happening in the COVID times. We are much more connected now. We talk to each other much more. We are, can facilitate a much better coordination between like-minded people, around the world. But things have not really happened. So my appeal would be that the major civil society organizations here, including the Third World Network, the MSF, and many others who are actually the frontline organizations in this fight to ensure that there's a better balance in IP, in the IP area. They should actually try and sort of expand the groundswell so that we get a more balanced regime at the end of the day. That's all I can say, from hindsight. Thank you.
Any remarks from Yuan?
Yeah, I think very quickly and echo what have been discussed and what Professor has mentioned. It's really a time now. I think the waiver proposal process, we really appreciate the courageous of India and South Africa really take this very bold step. We said that the negotiation process is difficult because there's such an entrenched understanding of how IP works from certain sector. But I think this is a really unique opportunity to look hard. It's also opportunity to force countries to sit down and also force to really closely look the limitations of relying on some of the existing mechanisms. And we hope actually going beyond the particular discussion in TRIPS Council that could force or kind of generate a serious discussion actually for the future pandemic, future R&D. To what extent this model of relying on monopoly, relying on companies are really sustainable? I mean, in our observation, it is already not fitting the purpose, and in the pandemic, it is further demonstrate how this logic is problematic. Of course, it's required more time to reflect, and we hope the waiver process could go positively, and more countries could join India and South Africa to have this historical opportunity and really review the kind of legal options that could empower developing country, not just let developing country, especially in low and middle income countries, to wait for charity. There has to be a decent empowerment so that our capacity in different developing countries can be mobilized and serve the greater good globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan. And now, Srinath, over to you. We can proceed to conclude now.
Yes,
so thank you once again to all the speakers. And now, Srinath, please.
Yes, I would like to invite Professor Yogesh Pai to give his thoughts and go ahead with the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinathji. It's wonderful to have this entire panel of eminent speakers. It was fantastic to have Professor Viswajit Dhar with us, along with Dr. Mustaqeem De Gama, Dr. Hu, and of course, Gop Kumar, who chaired this panel very nicely with all the right kind of questions that we had. Thanks to the audience who have raised the very pertinent questions. I don't have any closing remarks as such because we have already had a fantastic panel, but definitely I'm sure that, there is going to be some amount of amicable solution that's going to come out of this waiver, request made by India and South Africa along with other countries. One of the things perhaps that could be addressed in the later stages, if it progresses towards the General Council, would be to address certain kind of anti-diversion measures or trade diversion measures. and along with that also suggest how the legal requirements, to require disclosure of trade secret information within domestic legislations could be implemented in practice, because that's one of the tension points and tricky points of requiring what you call suspension of TRIPS obligations, particularly in the context of trade secrets under Article 39.2. So having said that, I think the year 2020 has been phenomenal. Hindsight is always 2020, and 2020 you can always view in hindsight. But we think that in the future, in the course of time, when the TRIPS Council has these informal meetings, there is going to be some amount of solution that is developed to address the problems that have been raised by developing countries, particularly in relation to the effectiveness in terms of the use of compulsory licenses, particularly in relation to export compulsory licenses, if there are particular issues in relation to institutionalizing them and effectuating them. And also in relation to the efficacy, as Professor Dhar mentioned, in relation to the tension points in Doha Declaration, because Doha Declaration really affirmed the commitments in the TRIPS agreement and the flexibilities contained in the TRIPS agreement, and it led to a legal solution in relation to export compulsory licenses. This time we have a waiver option that is proposed by countries, developing countries. We look forward to support from other countries in the near future. Having said that, the vaccine development and pricing is an ongoing story. There is a lot that is happening daily in newspapers in terms of vaccine pricing also. We need to keep a watch on that also to understand how the dynamics of all these things work in parallel. But nevertheless, I think it's a move by developing countries which they think is important for affirming what they think is their right towards affordable access to vaccines and all kinds of medical technologies pertaining to COVID-19. I thank one and all. I thank the panelists. I thank you all for joining in today from different parts of the world. On behalf of Chinmaya Viswavidyapeeth, National Law University, Delhi, Inter-University Center for IPR Studies and Third World Network, with the support of Indian Council for Historical Research, we have been able to conduct this wonderful webinar. I thank one and all. I thank Srinathji for having coordinated this entire event, and also the back-end team at Chinmaya Viswavidyapeeth and other heads of the institutions who have supported us. Thank you one and all, and have a nice time. Happy New Year to you in advance, and look forward to a wonderful New Year in 2021. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Happy New Year.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.